My name is Tom Quinn. I live in the UK. I'm in Shropshire. I've worked in IT and cybersecurity for around 15 years. I've done various things in that time, from systems administration and help desk, and I've written code, networks, databases. It'd be easier to say what I haven't done, frankly, all the way up to IT management. For the last few years, I've been focusing on cybersecurity, working in vulnerability management, and more recently, been in my current job for 5 weeks as a security manager for a large consultancy firm. They say that I hack for fun. I love things like Hack the Box and Try Hack Me. I write code in my spare time. I like writing in Python. Recently learned C. I do capture the flag events and things like that. And for me, it's a hobby. It's one that I enjoy. But it's also something that I think understanding technical details of exploits and hacks and things like that really helps support me at work and gives me a good background knowledge. I'm a certified information systems security professional. I know, people have different views on different certifications and things, but I worked hard for my CISP and I really value it, and I think it's a really good certification. And I'm on Twitter as TomQuinn8 if you would like to follow me. So why am I here? I am a big believer that risk is the foundation of everything we do in information security. Everything we should be doing, no matter what area we're in, we're talking about, from pen testing to vulnerability management, blue team, red team, GRC, everything should be about identifying and addressing risk. Risk is also a concept that is very, very familiar to business. It's very familiar to management. It's very familiar to senior C-level executives, boards of businesses are all very familiar with risk as a concept. So when we are trying to explain security issues to non-security people, when we're trying to obtain budget or get sign off on our strategies, it's useful to understand what C-level senior board people are concerned with, and they will understand risk. And being able to use the correct language and frame your argument in the correct way will really, really help. And I think this goes down all the way across our industry, from management down to boots on the ground people. If you understand risk, it's going to help you out. It's also really useful in terms of prioritization. So we've got loads of different things we can do, different controls we can put in. Do we want to put in a web application firewall? Do we want to change our endpoint protection? Do we want to do security awareness training? Do we want to do these things? And what order do we do them in? What's most important? What do we need to do first? By trying to evaluate the risk, and we can begin to put things into an order and say, this is the most important thing we're going to do. That's where we're going to focus our energy first, and then we can move on from there. And by doing that, it means that you are able to defend your position. Should anything ever happen and someone, maybe in audit or even legal, was to come and say, we've had a breach, why? Why did this get passed? Why did your cybersecurity strategy not address this? You can say, this is the reason we did what we did. We identified the risk. So I'm going to talk about the following. I'm going to go through and talk about some definitions of risk. I'm going to talk about some types of risk. I'm going to touch on how we can deal with risk. But overall, I'm just talking about the basics. This is not overly complicated. I'm not going to turn everyone into risk management professionals. What I'm hoping to do here is just give you the basics, the foundation. So let's talk about some definitions of risk. I've got an ISC squared definition on the screen. I'm a CISP. I put an ISC squared definition on the slide. This is a definition that I think really resonates with me, that risk equals likelihood multiplied by impact. The level of risk can be determined by how likely something is to occur and what the impact would be if it did occur. This risk matrix, you may have seen something similar to this I've seen these in loads of different documents and books and things like that, which is a kind of a representation of the size of the risk by differing likelihood and impact. So we can say from the bottom right-hand corner, we can say a risk that is highly likely to occur and has a large impact if it does occur is critical. And conversely, in the top left corner, if it's not very likely to occur, and if it did occur, it wouldn't have a large impact, then it's not a large risk. Now, I find this diagram a little bit dry. So on the next slide, I've tried to just create a more visual representation of the same concept using Super Mario. So the same concept applies in this diagram, right? In the top left, we're looking at a risk that is not very likely to occur. The gap is small, Mario can jump over it, it's fine. If the risk does occur, if Mario does fall down the hole, the impact is low because he can jump out. It might slow him down, but ultimately he can carry on his day, carry on playing the game. And the same on the top right, we now see that the likelihood is higher, the gap is larger. He will much more likely to fall down that hole, but he can still jump out. Moving down to the bottom of the diagram, you can see on the bottom left, again, the likelihood is now low, he can jump it, but if he does fall down it, he will lose a life, he will die, you will have to go back to the start of the level and start again. And then the representation of the critical risk in the bottom right is it's quite highly likely he's going to fall down that hole because that gap is big. And if he does, then he loses a life. This is what we would term a critical risk, highly likely to occur and with a large impact if it does occur. So I spoke about risk being likelihood multiplied by impact. So I'd like to break that down a little further. We can break likelihood down into vulnerabilities and threats. For a risk to occur, and we're talking about cybersecurity risk, for a risk to occur, there has to be a vulnerability to be exploited. And the vulnerability can be around something like a traditional IT vulnerability, you know, like an unpatched system or a misconfiguration, or it can be a weakness outside of that, like someone clicking a phishing link, or the possibility of someone clicking a phishing link, vulnerability. The threat is the people, the threat actors, the criminals in most cases, who are trying to exploit those vulnerabilities, who are trying to breach your computer systems. And it's important, if you're trying to analyze risk, you can look at trying to work out the likelihood. One area of doing that, or one way of doing that, is to look and say, I want to understand the threat. I want to try and understand who these people are. Why are they doing what they're doing? So we can look at the threat and say, we can be talking about things like advanced persistent threats. We could be talking about script kiddies, ransomware gangs, initial access, gangs who are just trying to breach systems and sell that access on. We can talk about insider threat, right? We talk about insider threat. We think of disgruntled employees, but we could also think of insider threat can be a mistake caused by an employee, right? An untrained employees could be considered an insider threat. And we can talk about supply chain. We can talk about how could a threat come from one of our vendors? Could a threat come from one of our customers? Is there a way that that could occur? And within the threat side of this equation, we're also talking about the volume of attacks. So if you're talking about how likely is a risk to occur, you're talking about breaching a computer system, you'd be looking at the vulnerability side of this equation and saying, how easy is it to exploit? How many vulnerabilities are there? And then you'd be looking at the threat side of the equation to say, well, how many people are trying to exploit the vulnerability? How skilled are they? If you're looking at lots of highly skilled people trying to exploit lots of easy to exploit vulnerabilities, then the likelihood's pretty high that that's going to occur. Now, as security professionals, when you look at this equation, you may have identified it already. We can only really control the vulnerability part of this. The threat side of this equation is external. The threat side is happening, and there's very little you can do to control that. So if you would like to reduce the likelihood of a risk occurring, logic would say you have to focus on the vulnerability path. And by reducing the vulnerability with a constant threat, the likelihood reduces. So again, we're going to come back to this very basic definition: risk being likelihood multiplied by impact. So we've touched on breaking down the likelihood. So how can we break down the impact? You may be familiar with the CIA triad. This is something that is kind of quite foundational within IT security. And this is a way of looking at how could we be impacted by a risk being realized. So the C in the CIA triad stands for confidentiality. We talk about confidentiality. We're talking about people having access to data or information or systems that they shouldn't do. So for confidentiality to be in place, the only people who can access data, information, systems are the people who are authorized to do so. So I can only access the information I need to do my job, the information that I have permission to access. Conversely, my personal data in various systems should only be accessible to the people who need it. If that isn't the case, there has been an impact to the confidentiality. The I in the CIA triad stands for integrity. In integrity, we're talking about not allowing data to be inappropriately changed by someone who shouldn't change it, or changed in a way that it shouldn't be allowed to be changed. And the fact that you should be able to access data and trust that it is in the state that you expect it to be in, that everyone expects it to be in, that it hasn't been modified somewhere with no one's knowledge. And then the A is availability. Can everyone access the data, information, and systems that they need to when they need to do them? Are the systems online? Are they available to be used? Now, obviously, cyber attacks, cyber risk can hit more than one of these. If you were to look at like your typical ransomware attack, you'd be saying we probably hit confidentiality and availability, because the ransomware is going to encrypt your network. It's going to take systems offline. They're going to be unavailable to be used. And the way ransomware gangs tend to work nowadays, with a kind of double extortion model, they will normally take your data and exfiltrate it before they encrypt the network, and then threaten to release it on the internet if you don't pay the ransom. That's affected the confidentiality of the data. So that would hit about two sides of the CIA triad. We can also talk about categorizing our impact into 5 categories. So a risk being realized could affect a business in one of these 5 ways. We could affect it operationally. We could affect the day-to-day running of the business. So this is an impact that would affect what the business does. A transport business, and you transport people and goods, we're talking about affecting the transport of people and goods. Your manufacturing business, we'd be talking about affecting the manufacture of products. An operational day-to-day impact to the business. We also talk about strategic impact. This would be impacting the future direction of the business, the strategy of the business, what the business is trying to do. So whether it's trying to move into a new market or develop a new product or switch the way it does business, the realization of a risk, the impact could be an effect on that strategic direction. It could also be a legal impact. The obvious legal impact is to say, well, you could be sued, and that is true. But within that legal category, I would also put in things like compliance and regulatory compliance. So things like GDPR, PCI DSS would sit within that legal category. as well as anything more specific. If you're in specific industries like healthcare or financial services or critical national infrastructure, there may be specific industry standards that you would need to adhere to that would sit within there. And again, you can see an impact. Cybersecurity risk can impact that. You could impact third parties. We talked earlier briefly about there being a supply chain threat. Well, there can also be a supply chain impact. If a cybersecurity risk is realized within my business, is there impact on my suppliers? Impact on my customers? Is there impact on any stakeholder connected to my business that is not within my business? They are third parties. That would be third party impact that we're talking about. And the final category, financial impact. The easiest one to give an example of, measured in pounds and pence, dollars and cents, euros and cents, wherever you are in the world. How much does it cost? How much is it going to impact our bottom line if this risk is realized? And I also want to just touch briefly on the concept of secondary risk. Would this risk being realized affect another risk? And we spoke and said risk is made up of likelihood and impact. So would the realization of this risk increase the likelihood or the impact of another risk? The impact could be a change in another risk, be a secondary risk. So what can we do about it? How can we deal with risk? There's 4 ways that risk can be dealt with. It can be avoided. And to avoid a risk, what we are talking about is completely taking the possibility of that risk occurring away. If you're talking about like an IT system, if we're talking about a server and we're saying the risk is that that server is going to be attacked or hacked, we turn it off. We unplug it. We avoid the risk entirely. Now, that may sound a little silly, and you'll say, but you can't use the system anymore. That's true. But it's an option, and it's one that should be considered, and it's one that I have seen in my experience, that's a way to address risk. If the risk is too high and the risk is bigger than the benefit the system is providing, it could be a very sensible decision to avoid that risk entirely and just turn it off, decommission it. Let's take it away. Or we can look to reduce the risk. Again, we have said that risk is made up of likelihood and impact, and that likelihood is made up of vulnerability and threat. To reduce the risk, we're going to want to reduce any of those, or all of those ideally. We're going to reduce as much of those as we can. So we're going to look at things like, okay, how can I reduce the likelihood? I can put controls in place, like I can start firewalling things off. I can try and put things behind VPNs. I can try and make things less accessible. I can put in controls like multi-factor authentication. I can do good vulnerability management to try and address that vulnerability. I can patch my systems. I can do VUN scans so that I can see where the gaps are. And then I can say, how can I reduce the impact? So I can look at things like segmenting my network and putting in good detection so that if anything happens, I know about it and I can shut it down nice and quickly. Would sit within the reduce category of risk management, of dealing with risk. We can transfer the risk. And when we talk about transferring the risk, this is largely insurance. So we can take out insurance, we can pay an insurance company, and we transfer the risk to them. It's no longer our risk, it's now their risk. If it occurs, they're the ones who feel the impact. They're the ones who have to pay out. And ultimately, we can accept the risk. We could say, this is a risk we're prepared to take. We're happy that it's something we're willing to do. In practice, you're likely to go through these in order. You're probably going to look at a risk and say, right, can we avoid it? How can we reduce it? Can we transfer it or transfer part of it? I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the time, sure, things like reputational damage, it's very hard. There will be impact, right? Even if you are covered financially by your insurance company, there's still the potential for a cyber attack to affect you reputationally. And ultimately, when you've done all of that, you get to the bottom and you say, okay, now I'm happy, I'm going to accept. And what you are accepting is the residual risk, the level of risk which is still there. After you've avoided, reduced, and transferred, what's left to accept is the residual risk. What level of risk is still there after your controls? There's a couple of concepts that I think are important to understand here. One is risk appetite. Risk appetite is the level of risk that a business has decided it is comfortable accepting. So for larger companies and for public companies, you'll see this in things like their annual reports. There may be a stated risk appetite. If it's not stated, it's still a concept that exists, even if it's never been written down. So the board or the management team or the chief exec or the owner of the business, whoever it is, depending on the size, will have a risk appetite. They will have a level of risk they're willing to take, that they deem to be worth taking. A different concept to that is risk capacity. And it's an important concept to understand, I believe. Risk capacity is not the level of risk you're prepared to take. It's the level of risk you can withstand without the business going under. The capacity of the business to be hit by risk after risk after risk. At some point, there's a point where the company can no longer trade, that it would go under. That is the risk capacity, which is going to be a lot bigger than your risk. Well, you'd hope it's a lot bigger than your risk appetite. Useful to understand these concepts and this language. So when you've avoided, reduced, transferred, and ultimately accepted the residual risk, you're in this position. And this is the position, this is how it should be. Everyone should be aware of the risk and aware of the level of residual, aware of the risk at the start. Everyone should be aware of the compensating controls. What have we done to address that risk? How have we avoided, reduced, transferred it? And everyone should be aware of the level of residual risk that remains. At this point, the risk can be accepted. And I'm not going to go into technical formal ways of doing this, like risk registers and like risk acceptance forms and all of this kind of boring stuff, because it is vitally important that it is reviewed and monitored going forward, because it can change. We know that risk is made up of likelihood and impact. Either of those two things can change over time. The likelihood is made up of vulnerability and threat. Either of those two things can change over time. The vulnerability, a new vulnerability could be discovered. The vulnerability could become easier to exploit. If there's like public proof of concept code, if someone writes a Metasploit module to exploit a vulnerability, well, suddenly that vulnerability, the same vulnerability, has now got a lot more likely to be exploited because it's easier and can be exploited by a larger amount of threats. The threat has increased because the complexity of exploitation has gone down. I've gone over, I think, a decent amount of content there on the kind of basics of risk management. So I just wanted to cover quickly what I think you can take away from this and to summarize. I've said it all the way through about what risk being made up of likelihood and impact, likelihood being made up of vulnerability and threat, how impact could be onto the CIA triad, or how it could be one of the 5 categories we spoke of earlier. I also spoke about how risk can be dealt with, how it can be avoided, reduced, transferred, or accepted. I'm happy now to take questions, as long as I haven't bored anyone to tears, to sleep.
Fantastic. That was a fantastic first talk. Thanks for giving it. That's pretty fun. We do have a few questions, actually. So let me just load them up. So Ray Redacted asks, you made a great point that we can only control the vulnerability part of the vulnerability times threat equation. Do you have any recommendation on how we could better assess the vulnerability part?
Oh, I mean, I could do a whole talk on vulnerability management because I love vulnerability management. But really, it's about, if I was going to answer that question as quickly and as short as I can be, it would be about knowing what you have and asset management. So you really need to understand what you have. And as a starting point, just look at it from the internet. The vast majority of attacks are going to be coming from the internet. So good asset management from an internet point of view. And the way I've done that in the past, you can do that using open source tools, and you can just do it yourself using things like Nmap. Just do a load of port scans of your IP ranges, get some idea of what's on those systems. And then if you can do vulnerability scanning, and there are open source tools to do that. I've never really used them. I would normally use commercial tools to do that, but then to get a visibility on what it looks like from the outside. And then internally, talk to your IT teams and make sure that they've got like good patching processes in play.
That's yeah. Eden, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, actually, I had a question myself. So, Tom, how does risk assessment tie in with threat modeling? Is this something like that should be considered when threat modeling, and are these practices a bit more independent, do you think?
So threat modeling was an item that I had on my potential to get into the talk when I was planning it, but it's not an area that I'm that familiar with. I've not done a lot of threat modeling in the past. So yes, it does, because when I spoke about talking about likelihood being vulnerability times threat modeling would sit within that threat side of that equation to really help you to understand that and to look at, and you would be touching on the vulnerability side as well, but to get an idea of who's trying to exploit this, how are they trying to exploit it, how easy is it to exploit, how many people are trying to exploit it, and that would help you to work out that likelihood via threat and vulnerability.
Awesome. Makes sense. Nikos, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. So Gosi asked, how do you explain risk to a non-security team to have them understand why you're asking them to do extra work?
Okay, so I like to focus on the impact to them, and to say, look, and I think it's the reason that I said over and over and over again, and the reason that many of my slides said risk equals likelihood times threat, is because I really think that sounds like a very simple concept, but understanding it helps you to have those conversations. It just means you can frame that conversation with those non-security people. You can say, listen, guys, I've looked at this and I've deemed that it's actually quite likely that this could happen. And the reason that that's quite likely that could happen is because the threat is big and the vulnerability is easy. And you can say, look, when we talk about threat, one thing that maybe some people outside of our industry don't understand is all threats aren't targeted. So people say, oh, we're not a target. We're a small business. Why would we be targeted? Well, it doesn't matter. One part of the threat is just spraying the internet, right? There are vulnerabilities that are just people are looking to exploit by just looking across the entire internet. I think when you start to explain that to non-security people, and you can say, we don't need to be targeted. These attacks are untargeted. They're just being sprayed. This is easy to exploit. And depending on your skill level, I've certainly had very good results by demonstrating exploitation myself. Like if you can say to an IT person, look, I have a shell on your system from the internet, right? If I can do it, then another attacker can do it. And the impact of that, look, I have root access. I can pivot. So I think just trying to frame it in terms of threat, vulnerability, likelihood, impact really, really helps to get your message across.